The registration file for humanity's primary diplomatic vessel arrived on a Tuesday. Dralvik knew this because he documented everything, including the day of the week, and because he had processed 40,000 vessel registrations in his career and had never once failed to note the date. He opened the file with the mild, professional interest he brought to all first submissions from newly petitioning species. A calibrated attention, neither dismissive nor excessive. The particular focus of someone who had been doing a job well for 200 years and knew the difference between thoroughness and theater. The documentation package was standard. Crew manifests, drive specifications, hull integrity reports, navigational logs. He read in order, as he always did, beginning with the vessel designation. UNSS Persistence. Primary diplomatic vessel, United Nations of Sol, Earth System. He noted the drive type, chemical fusion hybrid reaction drive, a technology the galactic community had largely retired 4 centuries ago, and flagged it for the technical review queue without particular concern. New species often arrive with older propulsion systems. It was expected. It was manageable. Then he reached the age entry. His filing system flagged it immediately. Data entry error, the system suggested with the particular polite firmness of software designed to protect users from themselves. He corrected it manually, entering what he assumed was the intended figure, and moved on. The system flagged it again. Same number, same entry, same polite insistence that what he was reading could not be what was actually there. Dralvik stopped. He read the number again. He read it a third time, slowly, the way he occasionally read sentences in languages he had only partially learned, not for the words themselves, but for whatever was underneath them. 247 years. The interior of his exoframe pulsed amber, a single involuntary beat of light that he suppressed before it could repeat. He looked at the navigational logs. 247 years of continuous operation, logged in unbroken sequence. More light years accumulated than most active military fleets currently maintained in the GTA registry. He looked at the maintenance records index. 17 volumes, physical and digital, spanning the full operational history of the vessel. 17 volumes. He had, in his career, seen 3. He opened a new document and began drafting the rejection notice. He did this on instinct, the way a craftsman picks up a familiar tool, not because he had finished thinking, but because his hands knew what came next. He was still reading the file as he wrote. It was only when he noticed this, that he was drafting a rejection while simultaneously reading more carefully than he had read anything in years, that he understood something about this file was different. He did not stop drafting, but he read to the end. The Persistence docked 3 days later. Dralvik watched from the Port Authority observation deck with his rejection notice already filed and the formal acknowledgement pending. He had expected. He was not sure what he had expected. Something diminished, something that would confirm his paperwork. Instead, the Persistence came through the approach corridor with the smooth, unhurried precision of a crew that had been bringing this ship into berths for generations. And the first thing Dralvik noticed was not how old it was, but how clean. Every repair seam on the hull was documented on the registry plates. Every patch was flush, sealed, professionally finished. The hull plating was not uniform. It had been replaced in sections over 2.5 centuries, and the variations in material age were visible if you knew what to look for. But the variations were ordered, catalogued, deliberate. Someone had kept records of every piece of this ship that had ever been replaced, and the records were there on the hull itself, legible to anyone who cared to read them. His exoframe made a small involuntary adjustment, a subtle shift in posture that he did not consciously direct. He stood up fractionally straighter. He told himself it was nothing. The ship moved through the final approach with the particular smoothness of long practice, not mechanical smoothness. The drives had a slight asymmetry he could detect even at this distance, but the smoothness of people who knew exactly how to work with what they had. The berth locks engaged. The Persistence settled. It did not look like a ship that had survived. It looked like a ship that had been kept. Captain Petra Holst had received his rejection notice before she finished docking. He knew this because her response arrived 9 minutes after the Persistence made berth, a window that allowed for exactly one reading, one consideration, and one reply. With no time wasted on either side, the message was brief. Come aboard for the mandatory inspection at his convenience. She would guide it personally. She had reserved time in her schedule for the full review. No argument, no appeal language, no request for reconsideration. Just an invitation, offered with the untroubled matter-of-factness of someone who had never once considered that the inspection might not go her way. Dralvik went. He filed it as procedural. Mandatory inspection of a vessel under review. Standard practice, nothing unusual. And he believed this, or told himself he did, which was not quite the same thing. Petra Holst was 58 years old and had the physical quality of someone who had spent their entire life in low-gravity maneuvering with occasional bouts of high-acceleration transit, compact, economical in movement, unhurried in a way that was structural rather than deliberate. She met him at the airlock with the ease of someone receiving a colleague rather than a regulator. She did not smile broadly. She did not perform welcome. She simply said, "This way." She'd start with the engine room. It was the part most people asked about first. He had not asked about anything first. He followed her. The engine room was in the aft section, 2 levels below the main deck, and it smelled of metal and oil and something faintly organic that he could not immediately identify. The drives were running at low idle. A sound that was not technically a sound but a vibration. He felt through the deck, plating, through the soles of his exo-frame, up through the articulated joints in a way that was oddly reminiscent of something he had not thought about in years. Chief Engineer Rosalind Odua was waiting for them, a small human woman of 51 with the particular self-possession of someone who has become, over decades, the foremost living expert on a single subject. She showed him the drives without preamble. They were, as documented, a chemical fusion hybrid reaction system, a propulsion technology that the broader galactic community had moved past 400 years ago, superseded by more efficient options, archived into the technical histories as an interesting evolutionary step. The Persistence drives were technically obsolete. They were also, by every diagnostic reading Odua pulled for him, running with a smoothness that the instruments confirmed should not be achievable at this drive age. Dralvik asked 3 separate diagnostic tools the same question and received the same answer each time. The drives were operating within optimal parameters. The drives should not have been operating within optimal parameters. The drives were doing it anyway. He asked the chief engineer how. She considered the question with the comfortable patience of someone asked to explain something they find genuinely pleasant to think about. You talk to her, she said. You listen. She tells you what she needs. Dralvik wrote this down. He was not sure why. It was not a technical specification. It was not documentable data. He wrote it down anyway in the small notation field of his handheld and moved on. The repair logs were here too, not just the digital index, but the physical volumes, lined on a shelf that had been built specifically to hold them, reinforced against acceleration stress, labeled in the careful handwriting of dozens of different people across 2.5 centuries. Odua pulled one from the middle of the row and handed it to him without being asked. He opened it at random. A repair made 180 years ago, cross-reference to a similar repair made 40 years before that, and in the margin, in handwriting that was slightly less careful than the main text, a single annotation. Same fix as grandmother used. Still works. The interior of his exo-frame dimmed. It was subtle, his bioluminescence dropping toward the low end of its range, the blue-white steadiness fading almost to nothing for 3 or 4 seconds before he pulled it back up. He was aware of Petra watching him without appearing to watch him. He closed the volume carefully and replaced it on the shelf and moved on. The crew quarters occupied the midsection of the ship, compact and layered in the way that long-duration vessels were always built. Every cubic meter earning its keep, every surface doing double or triple duty. There were personal effects visible in the common areas, the accumulated weight of lives being lived. A child's drawing penned near the galley entrance, framed photographs on a communal shelf. A pair of boots left in a corner with the proprietorial confidence of something that had been left there for years and had never needed to move. The Persistence did not feel like a working vessel with crew aboard. It felt like somewhere people lived, and the vessel part was simply the structure they lived inside. Petra did not narrate this. She let him see it. He asked how many of the current crew had been born aboard. She said 8, including herself, including her daughter. He asked if the others had served long. She listed 3 who had been aboard more than 20 years, 4 more than 10. She said this the way one states facts about atmospheric composition or orbital mechanics, useful information, matter of fact, requiring no particular emphasis. He noticed that she said our quarters rather than the crew quarters, our galley, our common space. He noticed she did not notice she did it. The memorial wall was on the forward bulkhead of the common area. Dralvik had known it was there. It was documented in the ship's registration materials, listed under historical features, given 2 lines of description. The description had not been adequate. It covered the full surface of the bulkhead, floor to ceiling, approximately 4 meters wide. Names, dates, roles, crew member by crew member, in chronological order of service, beginning with the Persistence original crew 247 years ago and ending near the bottom right with the most recently added entry dated 14 months prior. Beneath each name, a sentence. Sometimes 2. Josef Abramowitz was waiting for them near the wall with the ease of someone who spent a great deal of time in its company. He was 71 years old, born aboard, the oldest active crew member, and he had the particular quality of someone who had outlived enough of their world that they had made a particular peace with time. He maintained the wall. He had, over the years, written a significant number of the entries himself. He showed Dralvik the wall the way one shows someone a room they love, with genuine pleasure in the showing, and the comfortable restraint of someone who does not need to tell you it is important because they trust you to see it. Dralvik saw it. 847 names. He did not count them. He read the total from the notation at the bottom of the wall, added there in the same careful handwriting that annotated the maintenance logs, as if this were a comparable form of record-keeping. 847 people who had served aboard this vessel across its full operational history, each of them described, in a sentence or 2, by whoever had loved them most. Josef read one aloud. He did not say who it was beforehand. He simply began reading, in the calm, unhurried voice of someone reciting something they know by heart because they return to it often, a description of a first officer, dead 12 years, whom Josef had served beside for 3 decades, what he was like, the specific quality of his laugh, the way he had of listening that made you feel genuinely heard. Dralvik stood still and listened to a human man describe his dead friend to a wall, and the vocalization, harmonic in Dralvik's voice, rose without his control, a high, thin frequency overtone that escaped before he could suppress it and hung in the air for a moment before he brought it down. He pressed it back into silence. He asked who wrote the entries. Josef said, "Whoever loved them most." Dralvik stood for 7 seconds without speaking. He had processed 40,000 vessel registrations. He had documented 847 rejection filings. He had spent 200 years building a professional framework, meticulous enough to handle almost everything the galaxy had produced. And he stood now in front of a wall of names in a ship that should not fly, and felt his framework encounter something it had not been built to measure. He thanked Josef and moved on, and did not say anything else for a long time. The formal rejection order from GTA Central arrived while he was standing in a corridor on the port side of the lower deck, reviewing his preliminary notes. Vextoral had filed it with his customary precision. 17 regulatory failures, each one correctly cited, each standard legitimately and accurately applied. The filing was impeccable. Dralvik had worked with Vextoral for 30 years and recognized the work, thorough, correct, administered by someone who understood regulations as the highest form of institutional care. The rejection was legally sound. It was, by every standard Dralvik had spent 200 years upholding, correct. He read it twice. Somewhere in the ship, he could not immediately locate the source. Someone was playing a stringed instrument. He could not identify the style. It was not anything he recognized from any species musical tradition in the GTA registry, which meant it was human, which meant it was one of approximately 2,000 musical traditions he had not had occasion to study. The sound came through the corridor wall as a thin thread of melody, unhurried, with the particular quality of music played for no audience. He looked up from his handheld at the corridor wall. A repair seam ran its full length, documented, dated, initialed in small, neat letters by the engineer who had made it 40 years ago, a name he could not read from this distance. He stood in the corridor for several minutes. He was holding a rejection order he knew was correct. He was listening to music he could not identify. He was looking at the name of a person who had repaired this wall 4 decades ago, who might or might not still be alive, whose name was possibly on that wall in the common area, whose sentence might have been written by whoever had loved them most. He did not know what he was feeling. This was unusual. He generally knew what he was feeling. He had simply, over a long professional life, become skilled at whether to show it. Petra found him there. She did not ask about the rejection order. She looked at him, at his exo frame standing in her corridor, holding his hand held, not quite looking at anything. And she said, "Crew dinner tonight, everyone aboard. He should stay. He should see what the ship looks like when it's full." He began to say that he was here in a professional capacity, and that dinner fell outside the parameters of a regulatory inspection. She waited. It was not appointed waiting. It was not strategic. It was simply the patience of someone who had been waiting for things her entire life, for systems to cycle, for transits to complete, for decisions to finish being made, and had gotten good enough at it that it no longer cost her anything. She simply waited with the ease of someone who had nowhere else to be, which was perhaps true. Dralvik accepted. He filed it to himself as an extended observational review. He was not certain he believed this, and he was becoming less interested in the distinction. The crew dinner was in the common area, the memorial wall at one end of the space, the galley at the other. 31 humans, the Persistence full complement, present in a room that had clearly been built to hold 31 humans, not as a maximum but as a designed capacity. The space arranged around this number with the easy familiarity of something that had been the same for a very long time. Dralvik sat at the end of the long table nearest the bulkhead and observed. This was his default, the professional position of someone accustomed to assessment, and it lasted approximately 20 minutes before he noticed he had stopped doing it. He saw Roz describe a repair she had made the previous week to the secondary coolant coupling, a repair that had taken her 4 hours. That had required fabricating a replacement component from spare stock because the original part had not been manufactured in 60 years, and that she had documented in the maintenance logs with the same care and pride she brought to describing a repair made 180 years ago by someone she had never met. She spoke about the ship's systems with an affection she did not bother to disguise. And when the crew member beside her asked if she was ever going to stop talking about the coolant coupling, she said, "Probably not," and the table laughed in the easy way of people who have been laughing at variations of the same joke for years and still find it genuinely funny. He saw Yosef at the far end of the table, in the seat that the memorial wall, if he had been paying attention to its layout annotations, would have told him was the traditional seat of the senior crew elder, a position that had existed since the Persistence 3rd decade of operation, maintained without apparent discussion or formal designation, simply known. He saw Petra reach across the table to correct a navigational calculation on her daughter's handheld. Not asked, not announced. She simply saw it, reached over, corrected it in 2 keystrokes, and withdrew her hand. Lena's face cycled through irritation to recognition, to something that was not either of those things. Something more complicated and less finished. The face of someone processing a feeling they had not yet decided what to do with. Petra did not see it. She had already moved on. Dralvik saw it. He thought, she does not know how to tell her. He thought very quietly, in the part of himself that he did not generally allow into his professional assessment, "She does not know how to tell anyone." He recognized this. He was not sure he had known he recognized it till just now. The dinner was 3 hours long. The last hour was songs, actual songs, several of which appeared to be specific to this ship, with lyrics that referenced crew members by name and navigational events by their informal designations. A living oral history embedded in music that everyone at the table knew at least some of. Dralvik could not follow the words. He could follow the faces. At the end of the third hour, when the table was beginning to clear and the sounds were settling from celebration into the comfortable low murmur of a community moving toward rest, he found himself sitting in the empty end of a room where 31 people had just been, looking at a wall of 847 names, and the interior of his exoframe dimmed almost to nothing. He sat in the quiet for a long time. He did not recover the light quickly. He thought about his own species. The Chorus Collective lived in fluid groups, not families exactly, not crews exactly, something that was both and neither. A form of communal existence that was as natural to them as breathing in their atmospheric layer. They were never alone in the way he had been alone for the past 60 years, sealed inside his exoframe in standard gravity environments, defaulting to vocalization, because bioluminescent communication required proximity and trust and a willingness to be seen. He had come to the GTA at 40 years old, filed his expression-neutral faceplate as his professional presentation, and had been suppressing his harmonic overtone in meetings ever since. He thought about the 847 names. He thought about the sentence beneath each one. He was quiet for a very long time. He left the Persistence after midnight and returned to his office and sat down at his desk and did not begin drafting anything for 40 minutes. He simply sat. This was not something he did. He was a person who worked when he was at his desk, who drafted when he was drafting, who kept the professional machinery running because the professional machinery had been, for a long time, the primary structure of his existence. He sat. Then he looked up the Category 7 Heritage Exemption. It took him longer than he expected to find it, not because his filing system was inefficient. It was, by any reasonable measure, exceptionally efficient, but because the form had not been accessed in 200 years, and the path to it had been archived behind layers of outdated navigation that no one had needed to update, because no one had needed to go there. He found it in the physical archives, not a digital backup, the form itself, paper, yellowed at the edges, printed in a font 3 generations out of standard use, requiring a physical pen to complete rather than a stylus. He found a pen. He filled out the form slowly, choosing each word, reading each section with the care he would normally reserve for a particularly complex technical specification. The Category 7 Heritage Exemption existed, as its preamble noted, for vessels of exceptional historical continuity that represented a living cultural and operational record irreducible to standard technical parameters. It had been invoked 9 times in GTA history. The last invocation was 211 years ago. In the justification section, he wrote for a long time. He wrote that the Persistence did not fail the 17 regulatory standards through negligence or inadequacy of care. He wrote that it failed them because the standards had been designed for vessels maintained through regular modernization cycles, and the Persistence had been maintained through something else. Through continuous, documented, generational attention of a kind the regulatory framework had not anticipated and could not measure. He wrote that the maintenance logs were the most comprehensive he had encountered in 40,000 vessel reviews, and that their comprehensiveness was not incidental to the vessel's condition, but causative of it. He wrote, "The ship does not work despite being old. It works because of the specific way it has been cared for, by specific people over a very long time." He wrote, "In 40,000 vessel registrations, I have never encountered a filing that required this form. I have never encountered a vessel that was this form. The UNSS Persistence is not a ship awaiting decommissioning. It is a ship that has never once been given a reason to stop. He submitted the filing at 2 in the morning. He sat in the silence of his office for a while. Through the Port Authority windows, he could see the Persistence in its berth. Lit for overnight mode, running lights low, the drive vibration settled into the barely perceptible murmur of a vessel at rest. Someone had left a light on in what he believed was the engine room. He thought about the original drive casing, still there, still functional, polished by hand every week for 247 years, not because it needed polishing to function, because someone had decided it was worth keeping clean. The heritage exemption was approved 6 weeks later. The Persistence was formally registered in the GTA Active Vessel Database as a Category 7 heritage vessel, the oldest active ship in the registry, by a margin of 190 years. The approval came with a notation from the GTA Heritage Committee, which had apparently convened specifically for this case, that the filing was the most thorough exemption justification in the committee's recorded history. Bextorall sent him a message that said simply, "I read your filing. I understand why." He did not say he agreed. Dralvik did not expect him to. He respected Bextorall's consistency the way he respected his own. It was possible to understand a choice and not make it yourself, and possible for both positions to have integrity. He replied that he appreciated the message and meant it. Petra sent a message that said, "Thank you." 2 words. She was not a person who used more words than she needed, and he had stopped finding this reticent. He replied, "The ship earned it." She replied, "Yes, it did." He retired 6 months after the registration was approved. He had been considering it for some time. He was 200 years old, and the Chorus Collective's equivalent of late middle age was a flexible concept. But he had been in this office for 60 years and had filled his professional framework many times over, and there were things he had not been attending to that he thought perhaps deserved attention. His colleagues held the small ceremony these things warranted. Someone made a speech. Someone else made a shorter speech that was better. They gave him the customary retirement plaque and the customary leave-taking, and he accepted these with the quiet humor he showed rarely enough that people always looked slightly startled when it appeared. In his personal effects, when he had finished packing, they found. Colleagues who helped with the process later mentioned it to each other in the particular way people mention things they find unexpectedly moving. A small framed photograph. Someone had taken it the night of the dinner aboard the Persistence, catching him off guard in the engine room. He was standing beside the original drive casing, the one that had been polished by hand every week for 247 years. The lone engine room lighting caught the metal in amber and gold. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the ship, with an expression that his expression-neutral faceplate should not have been capable of showing, and was showing anyway, the particular look of someone who has been reminded of something important they had been trying for a long time not to think about. He had been alone inside his exo-frame for 60 years. He had worn the neutral plate because neutrality was professional, because what you showed of yourself affected how you were perceived, because the Chorus Collective's bioluminescent openness was suited to the deep atmospheric layers where everyone's light was already visible to everyone else, and not to the Port Authority offices of the Galactic Transit Authority where he had work to do and forms to file, and 40,000 vessels to register with precision and care. He thought about the 847 names. He thought about the sentence beneath each one. He thought about Joseph reading his dead friend's description to a wall in a voice that did not waver. Because you could love something that was gone and still carry it cleanly, if you had been paying attention while it was there. He thought about what his sentence would be. He thought, whoever loved them most. He thought about whether there was anyone who would write his, and whether the sentence would be one he would be satisfied with. And he sat with his question for a long time in the quiet of his office before he decided that the answer was no, and that the answer was also, perhaps for the first time in a long time, not final. He was 200 years old. He had, if the records were any indication, quite a lot of time remaining. He thought about the Persistence, how it had not survived by accident, how it had survived because no one aboard it had ever been willing to let it not survive, how survival and love were, in the end, not so different from each other. He thought about the things he had kept in his life, and the things he had set down, and which of those choices he would make differently. He thought, there is still time. There's still time to make it so. He closed his office for the last time. He took the photograph with him. He did not take the expression-neutral faceplate.